Welcome to the official YouTube channel for the Colin Cowherd Podcast. Go on, hit the subscribe button. There you go, right down there. If you want to be among the first to hear my weekly takes, NFL, college football, more, right there. Yeah. One of the things I want to shift to, because the schedules came out last week, some college football schedules.
I had a bone to pick with you. I wrote it down, so maybe we'll get into it right now.
Okay. Let's do it. So I said, as somebody that grew up with the Sonics, when the Sonics left Seattle, people said, Colin, you were outraged. And I'm like, listen, I went to Key Arena. There was no parking. It was dark. It sucked. It didn't drive revenue. What do you want me to say? Like, you got to, it's a banner. Downtown Seattle's always been kind of dark and gloomy. It's not a vibrant downtown. I'm like, I'm sorry. And when the Pac-12 imploded, I said, I've been telling my friends this for years. There's too much to do in the fall and like August 28th till October 18th. I'm sorry. The Pac outside of Oregon and Washington, there's just empty stadiums. There's too much to do. We got pro sports in Seattle, Stanford, the Bay Area. Nobody talks Stanford and Cal. And I'm like, it just doesn't work. I mean, you're giving the Pac-12's TV contracts giving USC $30 million. The Big Ten will give them $90. It's not hard. And the executives at Fox are guesstimating that the Big Ten ratings this year will go up 18%. That's big. In a lot of those games are on cable, 18%. And I said this, you start looking at some of these schedules, John, Jesus, I have spent, Sundays are work days for you and I. They're work days. We do a podcast on Sunday night. I'm around my TV. I go get a big workout in, sometimes go for a hike. By 10:05 Pacific, I'm ordering DoorDash. I'm there doing sit-ups occasionally for exercise. I'm watching TV for 8.5 hours.
It's not digging ditches, but it's a long day.
Yeah. Saturdays now. You start looking at the time zone. So whereas the SEC, there's only 2 time zones represented. You can have an Oregon game, then you can do an Iowa game, then you can do an East Coast game. I told my bosses, like, we've got to figure out a way to give somebody on our staff vacation time in the fall. Like, this is 7-day work week now. I cannot wait for college football. So I'm going to move into my controversial take of the week, which is, I always thought rivalries were big in college football, but what's going to happen now is the 12-team playoff is going to usurp everything. It's just going to become bigger than everything. And those storied rivalries just won't matter. Michigan, Ohio State will, Iron Bowl will, but most of them, the ratings for the college football playoff are going to be gigantic, and you're going to have to move off rivalries. Because what you don't want, if you're USC, you're 6-1, you stun Oregon and Eugene. Instead of a bye before Ohio State, you're going to South Bend November 9th. And I'm like, you get knocked in the ass twice on those, and you're going to be like, yeah, I'm over the Notre Dame game. Now, Notre Dame needs it, but my take is, you guys may want to reconsider this in this conference.
Well, before we get into the elephant in the room on Lincoln Riley, I don't disagree. Let's use the Northwest. The Apple Cup and the Civil War, Oregon and Washington have always been a rivalry game, but those 2 games, Oregon State, Oregon, Washington State, Washington, were a bigger rivalry. Those are gone. No, they're Mountain West team. It doesn't matter anymore, and it won't with every passing year. And Oregon and Washington will probably grow in power and popularity that game.
Certainly in relevance.
I would say 2x every year. It'll get bigger and bigger. But the Notre Dame thing's separate, because eventually, are you in agreement that both these conferences, or I guess where football is going to end is like 2 conferences, like the AFC and the NFC, Big Ten, SEC. So yes. Notre Dame, the regional, is going to end up in the Big Ten with USC, and they'll eventually play each other. So to me, that is separate from Lincoln Riley, who is going into his 3rd year. And I heard you talk about Notre Dame. I haven't heard you address this. Are you in agreement it's embarrassing for this story to come out? Because Brian Kelly, a lot like Lincoln Riley, both going into year 3, both losing their quarterback, both new defensive coordinators. I looked at LSU's schedule. They also play UCLA this year, and they add Oklahoma. They play Alabama every year. Ole Miss is a top 10 program. For Lincoln to beg to get out of that game. A couple weeks ago, I played golf, and I didn't know this, but on hole 4, one guy had a USC towel on his bag. And I started talking to one of the guys. He's like, he was in Reggie Bush's recruiting classes, was on that USC team for 5 years. So we start talking over the course of the round. And this guy was like a role player, he played on these teams. And he brought up a point. If we would have in 05 would have practiced against that team, we would have hurt guys. And I said, USC getting out of this game, one of the reasons we all were so excited for Lincoln to come here, $120 million, bringing like USC back, right, to be a powerhouse. And then 2 years later, he's begging to get out of LSU. He's not playing in Baton Rouge. They're playing in Vegas. But I think we all know it's going to be a tough spot for him. But he can't say, our schedule's harder. Well, so's theirs. And LSU, and this is where I respect Brian Kelly. Like, no, we're playing that game. I played Florida State the last 2 years. I got my ass kicked last year, remember, opening weekend. But I watched the clip with you and Feldman. You can lose several games now. You could probably 9-3. There are going to be a couple 9-3 teams probably left out, and some teams.
Well, USC
agree it's a bad look
though
for Lincoln Riley to want out of that game. The Notre Dame thing's separate. What's his beat? Why doesn't he? He's in year 3, Colin. This isn't year 1. He's had 3 years to build this thing.
So let me defend. This is something I've talked about behind the scenes with coaches. So when you leave, what I would call sort of middle of the night leaving for a new job, like Saban at Michigan State, whoever wants to come, get on the plane, right? Like this happens in college football. Lane Kiffin, Tennessee to USC. So what you usually do is you go to your staff and you say, you call them late. You got a plane lined up. Guys, I'm going in 90 minutes. Meet at the airport. And you take whoever comes on the staff. I think deep down, Lincoln didn't think Alex Grinch was great and was disappointed with him. And Alex knew he was in trouble if there was a new coach. So Alex got on the plane. But when the guys get on the plane, you got to give them 2 years. You can't just say after 8 games, you're not it. So Lincoln felt this incredible loyalty to somebody I think he would have moved off of. And so Grinch probably thought, I don't have Lincoln to support me. I'm getting canned. I'm getting on that plane. And so I think this is the first year where Lincoln really, really thinks he has an elite staff. So that's first of all. They've been overcoming some of this staff stuff, loyalty to positions they don't really want to be loyal to. The second thing is Pete was in a different time. There was no NFL, much more tribal USC following. The market was different. You didn't have a conference championship game, semifinal games. If you won the Pac-12 and looked good, you're playing for a natty. It's hard. And I don't think Denver West, you have the defensive front 7 personnel of the South and Texas and Georgia. So I think between Alex Grinch and the reality is we got a lot of quarterbacks, receivers, corners out here, maybe an edge rusher. We don't have a lot of bigs. We just don't. I think it's been a tougher lift than Lincoln Riley on the defensive side than he realized it was going to. I think he thought he would just outsmart and outscore everybody. He did that his first year. He did. If they beat Tulane they were leading late. If they beat Tulane, we look at year 1 and go, shit, they won 12 games with 2 NFL players. That's impressive. So then the second year, I don't think you would look at it the same. But that Tulane loss just was horrific. And so my takeaway is he doesn't want to say it publicly, but they feel like they're playing catch-up defensively in this program.
And I'm not expecting Lincoln, especially at this point, to look like the 05 Trojans. Like
I think they'll win 8 games this year.
But they also 6 is on the table, right? If things get weird, would you agree? but
I think, if Miller Moss is as bad as he was in the spring game, 6 is on the table.
Brian Kelly has a new defensive coordinator too. He fired his guy because they were historically poor. And I'm with you on Pete, but I remember, and the internet and the world was not the same, obviously, in 04, 05, 06. Pete was going all over the country to recruit. And I just wonder, and I've said this for a while, I like Lincoln. I've met him a couple times. He came on this podcast a couple years ago. But I do think, I said this to you last year, and I just think big picture is something to watch. Like, small town Texas guy, this U.S. thing's kind of a different animal. Would Lincoln have more success, at the University of Texas or back at Oklahoma? Obviously, he's more suited that. This story comes out, all the people behind USC viewed him as like going to get back to the Pete days and be like, we're not scared of anybody. Kind of the way Kirby Smart acts or Jim Harbaugh acts. And obviously, I'm not saying all these programs play people, but once it's on the schedule, Brian Kelly's a good example. Like, he wasn't scared, and his schedule's not easy, but he knows he can go out west and recruit. So I just think that, I don't know, it's a pretty big red flag for me. And I understand that they're an underdog, right? They're a 6-point underdog. Like, most people think they're going to get their ass kicked. But this is this is year 3. So it's now the game's different, NIL, the portal. But I'd say, shouldn't USC, you know better than me, have the money to just be going toe-to-toe with Texas and Ohio State, or do they not, NIL-wise?
No. Or Georgia, Texas, and Ohio State, and Oregon's 4th, have sort of separated mostly from the country on NIL. I think USC's collective is better now. UCLA's is terrible. It's a joke. Like, they'll do fine in basketball where you need, I've been told, $4 million, you can win a national championship. Football, you may need 12. I think USC's closer to 7.5.
UCLA's in major trouble going to the Big Ten. Would you agree? Football-wise? Here's
what's funny. Yes. Now, the good news is they're going to fill the Rose Bowl a few times with your Wisconsins, Nebraskas, Iowas. They're the big winner in this, because Oregon, Washington don't need road fans. USC does a little. UCLA is desperate for them. So UCLA, it's a windfall economically, from $30 million in an empty Rose Bowl annually to like $70 million and a full Rose Bowl 4 times. UCLA is going to pay some bills, but they're going to have to just live off high school players, or grabbing these sort of like the best player on Yale or Toledo. And those guys, by the way, Wyoming, they're okay. They're not NFL guys, but they're okay. You can have 4 or 5 in your roster. I think the big winner in this, of all these schools, I think the big winner will be Oregon, because next to Ohio, except Ohio State, they can go toe-to-toe NIL with anybody. And I think Oregon will look big. Jed Fish will win at Washington. I don't think he's Kalen DeBoer, who I think is the best new coach I've seen in probably a decade. Just in terms of top to bottom, I think he's
Look at his career record. He's like 120-10, coaching everywhere. I think Oregon's the big winner. I mean, is it fair to say, I mean, they have a legitimate chance to win the national championship this year, right? I mean, Ohio State's going to be tough. I mean, I think Ohio State, they spent like $15 million.
They play in Eugene.
Get them in Eugene. It's, Harbaugh leaving is a huge win for obviously the Pac-12 teams coming in, but also Ryan Day, because that was not going well. And Sharon Moore, impressive guy, but you don't lose Harbaugh and sustain the same thing.
Well, God, they
lost like 25 NFL players too.
And they were all like leaders. Yeah. And a lot of them were like 4th and 5th year linemen. I mean, they just leaned on the Buckeyes the last 3 years in the second half. Like, Michigan's not going to look the same. They're not going to look the same. And that's not a knock on Michigan, but you can't lose like 8 elite linemen who were sort of leaders in the clubhouse.
One thing that's going to change in college football, I know a bunch of my scouting buddies bitch and moan about all this, is like the COVID, that year that didn't count. So you had all these guys that were like 5th, 6th year guys that usually would be in the NFL. It's been a little out of whack, right? Washington, I mean, Michael Penix, and I like the player and I'm rooting for him, but he played in college football for about 17 years. So, I mean, those days are kind of, and we're just going to get back to the feel of Alabama, Ohio State having these 2nd and 3rd year guys being the core of their team. And then those guys will go to the end. I think, and this is the thing with the USC, that story coming out, it feels like Dan Lanning would not have done that. Now, Dan Lanning inherited with Mario recruiting a much better program. I'm not disputing that.
Much better players.
But it just does feel like the ethos of USC, fucking play you wherever. Parking lot, NFL team, who cares? It feels far, far removed, which was understandable when they were going through the turmoil of Clay Helton. But once you got Lincoln, it felt like we were kind of going to get our swag back, and it feels like there's still some insecurity there.
Listen, 2 Oregon State players will be 2 of their top 4 defensive players, a linebacker and a safety. They'll be 2 of their 4 to 5 best defensive players. Oregon State.
They've been good the last couple of years.
So that's
in fairness, but I hear it.
Yeah, Jonathan. Yeah, that's not the way it works. Usually, it's you're not going to take a Kentucky football player, 2 of them transfer to Georgia, and they're 2 of their best defensive players. And the other kid, who may be their best defensive player, is a UCLA defensive back. So it's, yeah, they're playing catch up. I will say though, I've loved college football forever. I gave it a rest for about 7 years. I really peeled back my college football talk because I thought it got incredibly regional with Bama and Georgia. And I just thought, I'm not doing a show for the South. So I would say I used to be about a 25% college football show. Some years at ESPN, I was 30% during the football season. I peeled back to about 6%. I think I'll be closer to 15, 18%. I just think there's a ton of good stories. Um, my guess on what USC becomes, and again, their 2025 recruiting class is actually their best. There's like big bodies. My guess is if Lincoln stays, they will not be Ohio State. They won't. But they'll be in the running with Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, and USC in that 10-win, could make it to a conference championship, but it will be Ohio State. When Harbaugh leaves, it will be Ohio State's conference going forward. That's my guess.
Agree. I mean, they're rosters. I mean, they spent like $13 million on 4 guys in the transfer portal. All of them reviewed as top 20 picks. You know, I mean, they got a guy from Alabama. I mean, they could be really, really good. Now, I'm not the biggest Chip Kelly guy. We'll see on that one. I don't know. I think the offense, but defensively, they've been a lot better. And Ryan Day's an offensive guy, and they have so much talent on offense. But the Harbaugh move really might have saved Ryan Day because his record is remarkable. But you know the way that operation, you can't lose to Michigan 4 years. They got their butt kicked again. People would start asking questions because there's not a program in the country, and this would include Georgia, that is spending more money, right, on the coaching staff and on the players than Ohio State. Like they are spending the money. They're like the George Steinbrenner Yankees right now.
I've argued their biggest dilemma was that they recruit at now such a high level at receiver that they lost their identity offensively. As they were so good at receiver that at practice, they passed more. You had to get the ball out in the flat. You got 5-star guys. And I think Michigan last year had one receiver I liked, but they weren't a great perimeter team offensively. They were great. And what they did the last 3 years is they became Ohio State. They just pounded you. And Ohio State had so much perimeter talent. It's impossible as a coach. Ryan Day and offenses at practice, looking at Harrison, looking at these guys and thinking, I got NFL corners and they can't cover these guys. I know Purdue can't. And so they kind of became, to me, a little bit of a finesse version of Ohio State, which played into Harbaugh's hands, where he loves physicality. That's why Stanford started pushing around USC at the end. They became almost old USC, where they just ran the ball. Even Andrew Luck was a physical component at quarterback. So I think my take with Ohio State, their issue has simply been they're so gifted that it's like anything else. Like, you know, if you had a great singing voice, you probably wouldn't be an NFL scout. You know what I mean? Like if you're giving, you know, if I was 6'8", I would have played basketball longer. I would have probably tried to really make a career out of it because I loved the sport. There are certain limitations. Like Ohio State has no limitations on the perimeter. They're probably the most gifted college football team in terms of talent on the perimeter. And I think it kind of diluted their power.
You know,
game.
one thing you brought up earlier, I would say last year is a good example, probably of the 12 weeks in college football. There are probably 4 or 5 throughout the year where there's a lot of games that just don't matter. And as long as you watch the one big game,
I know it.
You start looking at the schedule, like LSU, Oklahoma, Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, Oregon, sprinkled throughout you get 2 or 3 marquee matchups, probably 80% of the weeks. So like you said, Saturday kind of becomes a little Sunday light. And we've talked about this before. That Sunday morning slate kind of stinks now.
It's not as good as it used to be.
Because they're all in on Amazon. They're all in on the primetime games. And obviously CBS and Fox, the afternoon games. You're getting a lot of Carolina Atlantas, you know, in the Minnesota, Tennessee Titans in the morning. You're like, I'm not even going to talk about this game. Do I need to just have it on the background?